Today we're going to be introducing the logic of experiments and also talking a little bit about research ethics. Um, and well, let's just move on. Okay. All right. So the objectives today are to explain why experiments are the ideal research design. Now, that's to be said. Um, there's no problem with doing other kinds of research other than experiments. It's just the basic idea here is that there's experiments are in fact special. Um, be able to define and use the concept of internal validity. Um, this is really important, and it's kind of the core of well-done research. So we'll talk about that a little bit and describe ethical concerns in experimentation. So here we are today at this point in our research diagram or the research process. We're going to choose a research design. So we're going to, in this case, we're going to talk about experiments and we'll talk about others. And then again, also just a little bit about the ethics of data collection. So here's an example that we like to use here. So thinking about like using visual aids in a classroom setting. So things like PowerPoint, using videos, using the Blackboard, which you'll notice, I've definitely been using like last week and this week these note cards instead of the Blackboard, since, well, we don't have a Blackboard. Anyways, the idea here is, does this improve student attention or the recall of lecture material, or both, as the case may be? How would we go about that? Let's say we wanted to let's say we had 3 different classrooms. So that's what we're going to do here. Let's say we got our red, actually that's stupid. Let's erase that. Let's match up our colors here. So let's do our yellow here. Our red and our blue. All right. So the idea here is, with an experiment, what are we trying to do? Let's say we have 3 different classrooms or 3 different classes in the same room, for instance. What makes an experiment unique? Well, the thing is, like, can we do it that way? Like, if we just bring people in and say, like, we're going to use no visual aids here in this yellow one, PowerPoint only in the red, and all 3 visual aids in the blue here. Well, if we see differences in student attention and memory, retaining of material between these 3 different classrooms, is it just because of the 3 different ways that we treated students with the visual materials? Because again, like, okay, let's say we even have the same classroom, but we have different classes. Some classes are harder, some classes are easier, some classes are more interesting, some classes are less interesting, all of those sorts of things. So the basic idea behind an experimental design is that we control the experimental treatment. So let's just say, like, even dropping this down to 2 classes, uh, or two conditions, right? Let's just say that as people came in, we assigned them to one of 2, like either the experiment or the control. And just it happened to be like when people came in, if I observed them to be male or female, I assigned them to one or the other condition. So like one condition was all men and one condition was all women. The difference that we observe might not just be due to the experimental treatment that we're giving them, but to the differences in biological sex there. So the idea behind this is, as you can see, like in this diagram, all of these, each one of these pictures is supposed to represent some factor, some variable, something. And so we've got, our hexagon, heart, star, flag, triangle, U-turn, cloud, and pie chart in each of these. And those are all the same, except for our cloud, right? So our cloud is yellow here, red here, blue here. This is the idea behind an experimental design, is that the factors that we choose to manipulate are going to be the only systematic differences between groups. So as people come into the classroom, we've got, I'm going to call it E and C. So if somebody comes in, I just flip a coin, for instance. And that determines whether or not, there we go, whether they wind up in. So you come in, I flip a coin, you wind up in C. You flip a coin, or you come in, I flip a coin, E, C, C, E, E, C, C, E, 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 you know, just so the idea here is with experiments that we're going to randomly choose whether or not someone's in the control condition or the experimental condition, or whatever condition it is. Like if we have more than, like as the picture, the diagram here shows, you know, this one has 3 conditions, everything else is the same. So the idea here is if we have a large enough sample size, the randomness sort of balances this out so that we would have about the same number of girls in one condition as in the other, boys, ethnic backgrounds, educational backgrounds, all of those sorts of things. Now again, it's not going to be perfect. We're not going to have exact. Let's say we have 100 people that are going to be a part of our experiment. It's not always going to be exactly 50 in one condition or the other. So let's say, you know, you even had going into it, like we had 50 males and 50 females. We're not going to have exactly, you know, 25 girls and 25 boys in each of the conditions. That's not the way it's going to work typically. I mean, that's the ideal. Like if we did this experiment over and over and over again, that's the element of randomness. That, like, in general, we would have, you know, 25 males in the experimental condition, 25 females in the experimental condition, 25 males in the control, and 25 females in the control. In the long run, like that would be how it would tend to balance out if we could do this over and over and over and over again. But that's not how it's going to work out in any particular case. So let me just turn the camera off for a second so you can see it. Clean this up. Oh, oops, sorry. So experiments try to simulate this scenario by creating equivalent groups in which the only difference is the experimentally manipulated independent variable. And that's what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make sure that all of these other extraneous factors are balanced between all of the conditions that we're looking at, whether it's whether these are race, ethnicity, educational background, industry, whatever it is. We just want to make sure that the only thing that systematically varies between groups is the thing that we as researchers have done. So experimental designs, like this is the most important factor in the experimental design, is that we manipulate the independent. Oh, sorry, I made a mess of that. Let's erase that. Here we go. Manipulate the independent variable. And that's just to say we set specific levels of the independent variable. That's to say, like, when I set specific levels, that might mean, like, if this is an all or nothing sort of thing, let's just say, hey, you know, we're interested in, like, I don't know, like, amount of protein in a diet, right? Like we would be experimentally manipulating the amount, like so. Maybe one group gets 0. That would, I mean, probably not what we would do, but like it's 0 protein in their diet. One group gets a certain like amount in terms of the percentage of their diet, like a third of the calories are coming from protein, and maybe one group is getting like a quarter or like half of their calories are coming from protein. Something along those lines, just random examples, but we're choosing it, right? So we have control, like as researchers, we have control over it. So we manipulate the independent variable. And then the other key feature here is that we are randomly assigning. Oh, man, I am really bad at using this tool. Sorry about that, guys. So we are random assigning people to the levels of the manipulation. So like the idea here is like we set control versus experimental condition. We are saying there, like, if you're in the control condition, this is what you're getting. If you're in the experimental condition, this is what you're getting. But then we're using random assignments. So the idea is, as someone comes in, I was saying with the idea here, when somebody walks into the room that we're doing the experiment in, we flip a coin, right? Or whatever it is. It might be a spreadsheet. It might be, there are other ways of doing these sorts of things. But the basic idea is we're allowing random chance to determine who gets in what, right? We're not using our own judgment. So like if you come in, like if I use my judgment and just say, like, I think you're going to get the experiment, any biases that I might have can seep into our design that way. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to divorce ourselves from the process here. So each participant, the basic idea here is that every participant who comes in has an exactly equal chance of being in any of our conditions. So it's always easiest to talk about with just the two, your experiment versus your control. So like when somebody comes in, they have a 50% chance of being in the experimental group, a 50% chance of being in the control group. Which is why, like, illustrating this with like a literal coin flip is a really good way of going about that. Because when somebody comes in, I flip a coin. However it lands, it tells us which condition they're going to be in. Now, naturally speaking, the way this works out is like maybe it's everybody who comes in at a particular time is going to be getting the experimental condition. Not everybody who comes in will be the next time will be getting the control condition, but we do that part randomly. Ideally, though, we're talking about at the level of the participant, the person coming in, we are randomly assigning them to each one. And what random assignment does is it directly allows this control of our extraneous variables. So let's just see here. So controlling extraneous relevant variables. This is the idea of like what I was just saying with some things like biological sex or educational background or the industry that somebody works in. Those all might be relevant to the outcomes. So they might have impact on the dependent variable, right? So for instance, in terms of like, let's just say our dependent variable is number of hours a week worked, right? And so if we've got somebody who's like a lawyer, they may want, well, if industry might impact this. So lawyer versus, typical ordinary, like office clerk sort of jobs. One per like the latter might be working 40 hours a week, the former might be working 80 hours a week. So like there is a direct impact of industry on average number of hours worked or something along those lines, right? So if we want to look at what other factors go in, like amongst lawyers, some work more, some work less, amongst clerks, some are going to try to seek out overtime. So we might be interested in manipulating like some other factors to affect how many hours a week people work. And the basic idea here is that what we're trying to get when I talk about experiments being the gold standard in research design is that experimental designs maximize what we call internal validity. And so the idea here behind internal validity is this is really like the internal logic of the study. So what internal validity allows us to do is that, well, it really allows us to assert with a high degree of confidence that one variable affects something else. So high levels of internal validity in a study let us assert things like causation. So it's saying like, if I increase your protein intake, it will decrease your body fat composition. If we change your motivation, you will increase the number of hours that you work in a given week. Anything along those lines. But like, if we can say that with confidence, that confidence is coming from the experimental design. Because again, think about it, like if we just observe things, like we just say, well, like people who happen to eat more protein in their diet have lower body fat compositions. Well, there might be lots of other things going on, like people who eat more protein might also work out more, right? And so the idea here is what we're trying to make sure is that that doesn't happen. So that people work out on average the same amount, whether they're in the like low protein versus high protein condition, right? That on average people are doing the same sorts of things, so that we can't. The basic idea here is anytime you are looking at a study and you're saying, but what about some alternative explanation? the degree to which that alternative explanation is not ruled out is a threat to the internal validity. When we have done a really good job of ruling out all alternative explanations, so we were down to just the variables that we're interested in talking about, then we have high internal validity. So again, you'll want to take a look at how the glossary is defining this. But in general, like we're also going to talk about like specific threats to internal validity. So selection effect, subject effect, and experimenter effect. So selection effects are, well, when people are allowed, like choose to be, like this is where sort of random selection comes into play. And random assignment beyond that. So if people come in and are like, I want to be a part of your experiment because I think it's going to be important for me in some way. So like a sort of left field example of this is that very good hospitals often have high mortality rates because people choose to go to very good hospitals when they're extremely sick. So if we took just two hospitals, like a really good hospital versus a so-so hospital, we might expect sort of naively the quality of care that people would receive in the so-so hospital is less good, and therefore the people may be dying or sicker there. But in reality, we might actually see that the very good hospital has higher mortality, but people are coming often will choose to go to world-renowned hospitals when they're extremely sick. So so the idea here is like people may be doing better than they would otherwise. So like people who were equivalently sick, like so let's say we had two very, very sick people, and one of them went to the so-so hospital, and one of them went to the very good hospital. The person going to the very good hospital might do better. Like they might live longer or have better quality of life during their time living than the person going to the so-so hospital. But because that's not the way it usually works. Like people are selecting into the very good hospital. And so the idea is like if people have some sort of control over whether or not they're getting into the experiment or experimental condition versus the control condition, then we lose our ability to say that it isn't whatever reason that's driving that. And so it's not about the quality, like with the hospital example, it's now no longer about the quality of care, it's about how sick the patients are, yeah, as well as the quality of care. So one way around this, well, one way around all of these is really a double-blind design. So in general, under most circumstances, we try to keep it so that when people come into an experiment, they don't know whether they're getting experimental treatment or the control treatment. This is why, like again, in medicine, people use placebos, right? So everybody's taking a pill, but in some cases, those pills are just made of sugar or whatever substitute it is. In some of the cases, they have the medicine. That way, the participant doesn't know what's going on. With a double, so that's a single blind experiment, so the participant doesn't know which condition they're in. With a double blind experiment, the person administering the experiment doesn't know either. And this could be you as the researcher, or some sort of research assistant who's actually administering these. Like maybe you have, like as a researcher, you do know who's in which condition, but the people actually administering it don't know. So as the person administering the study, you come in, I don't know what's going on, that's above my pay grade, and I'm just giving you your pills. And I don't know whether they're sugar pills or the drug that we're testing. And neither do you. And therefore, as a result, you're not getting to pick which condition you're in, and I'm not really picking it either. I am controlling which one you're in by administering the pills, but I don't know what's going on, so I can't treat it any particular way. And this helps lay out the subject effect as well. So the subject effect is the case where, like, if people guess which condition they're in, they might respond differently than they would if they naively knew. So, like an example that I like, well, actually no, that's probably a better example of the experimenter effect. So with the subject effect, sometimes these are called helpful participants. So if somebody guesses what you're doing, they might try to do better on the outcome than like whatever your dependent variable is. Like they might put a lot of, like if they're like, somebody realizes they're in the experimental condition, they might come in and try really hard. Whereas if they find out they're in this boring old control condition, they don't put a lot of effort into it. So for instance, like let's say, and this will start to shade into the experimenter effect. And this is why both of these can sometimes float around. We sometimes call in research methods a demand effect. So if we communicate to somebody that they're in the experimental condition versus the control condition, we might get different results. But if people just guess it, and that's why having a good control is useful. So the idea behind a good control is that it looks the same at a surface level as the experimental condition. So if you think to the Morisano study, it's not like when the experimental subjects were doing their goal setting exercises, it's not like control subjects were doing nothing, they were just sitting going. They were doing this, like we often call this in cognitive psychology and other psychology disciplines, we call this a distractor task. So like people are still doing something active in the control condition. It's just not something that should have any impact on the dependent variable. Whereas the independent variable that we're actually manipulating, the one that we're setting in the experimental condition, we expect that it's going to have an impact. So people are doing something in both conditions. Whereas like if we brought in, like if our experimental subjects came in and they were actively doing something, and the control subjects were just sitting there staring at the wall, the control subjects would probably have a pretty good idea that they were control subjects, and the experimental subjects might know that they were experimental subjects, especially if you're like administering these at the same time, so that some people can see that they're doing something, or your experimental subjects can see that they're doing something, and the control subjects can see that they're not, compared to the other group. So isolating the subjects is a good idea, but also providing these sort of distractor tasks so that you have a good control. By good control, we also, like I was saying, we also want to make sure that there is nothing in the task that you're having your control subjects doing that should impact the outcome in any way, the dependent variable. And the experimenter effect is kind of in some ways, the flip side of that. So let's say, like we're saying, like you come into the classroom to do the experiment, and let's say I flip the coin and it comes with heads. So you're in the experimental condition. I'm like, welcome to our experiment. I'm really excited. I'm enthusiastic. I can explain in a lot of detail what you're going to be doing and offer. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask. And then you go off and do the experiment. Whereas you come in and flip the coin, it comes up tails, and like, oh, you're in the control condition. Welcome to our experiment. Here's what you're going to be doing today. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask, or whatever. If I can act really enthusiastic towards experimental subjects, because again, that's probably where the juice of my experimental hypothesis is on that side. So if I act really enthusiastic to them, provide a lot of assistance, I might elicit better performance out of them than with a control condition who I'm treating very, very blasé. So under those, I think the best example of this I can think of is something that's called the story of Clever Hans. So Clever Hans was a horse whose trainer asserted that he could count and do all kinds of fun things like that. And people kept testing it and seeing it. So the horse would, you'd give it a number and it would stomp out, you'd say 7 and it would stomp 7 times and so forth. And, it looked plausible, but and this is a story, so I'm not quite sure how truthful it is. You can look it up. But anyways, what careful observation revealed was that it wasn't the horse that was counting; it was the trainer was really while the horse was stomping, say 7, so stomp, 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 and so forth. The trainer was and would stop doing anything once source got to 7. So the horse wasn't doing the thing it was responding to the positive feedback from the trainer. Uh, and so that's kind of what an experimenter effect is like as the experimenter, my interactions with you as the subject are helping to determine your behavior or results within the study outside of whatever the experimental manipulation is. Now, that being the case, like, as I said, one way of getting around this is blinding the study to both the subject and the experimenter. So if I don't know which condition you're going to be in, so again, like let's say like this can be done really easily with computers. So we just set things up so someone like comes in, they sit down at their computer, and then the computer using a random number generator or whatever just determines like when you're there, what instructions you're getting. So I greet everybody coming in the same way, give them their informed consent, sit them down, and the computer administers this. And I never know what's going on because I'm never experiencing it directly. And so the participants only experience something administered to them in the same way, regardless of whether it's an experimental or control condition. And again, I just want to be clear from what I said earlier that I keep talking about experimental versus control just because that's the easiest setting where we only have like 2 levels or independent variable. Control versus an experiment. But we could have 3. We could have like a control. We could have a low level setting, a high level setting. We could have whatever it is. So just to be clear. And then the other thing, the other major term to know from this is external validity. So internal validity is again about the logic of the study. We want to say that like things were set up so that whatever we observed within the study, we can confidently say really happened. Right? So if we saw that the variations in the level of the independent variable related to variations in level of the dependent variable, we can say that really happened, as opposed to low internal validity means there are alternative explanations. So we can say like, okay, so yeah, sure, the dependent variable varied with the independent variable, but there were these other things going on. That's low internal validity. We can rule, or at least strongly rule out alternative explanations. We have high internal validity. External validity is the idea that, okay, what we saw here, we'll see somewhere else. And this is something that is often, what's a criticism that's often leveled against like organizational behavior or other management studies that are done with university students. For instance, the idea here is, oh, these people are not full-time employees, oh, they're relatively young, oh, they're highly educated, they're this, they're that, all of these other sorts of things. So the idea here is with external validity, the idea is like, if I do my study in a particular setting, are there factors about that setting that limit whether or not this would happen somewhere else? So if like if I did my research all within one industrial context, would it replicate somewhere else? So if it was amongst professionals, would it replicate amongst skilled blue collar workers? If I did it amongst skilled blue collar workers, would it replicate amongst unskilled workers? If I did it with students, would it replicate with a working population? If I did it in the United States, would it also happen in China, for instance? And so like one way to ensure external validity is to have a truly random sample, which we'll talk more about sampling later on in the semester. But the idea here is like whatever population you want to generalize to, if you have a truly random sample from that population, then we have pretty good external validity. Now, that's not the way it often works with us. We often will be working with organizations that we have access to for one reason or other. Maybe they've invited us in to do some consulting work for them. Maybe we happen to know some people there and they're doing us a favor by letting us do this. Maybe we have cold called them. But again, the basic idea is the more if we can either match context, so if we're doing something in a student environment, we want to make sure that the claims that we're talking about generalize to other student environments. If we want to generalize to a working population, we want to be able to keep track of like how many of is a large proportion of our student sample employed. What hours do they work? Like how many hours in a week do they work? How well trained are they? all of those sorts of things. So again, external validity is hard. Well, both internal validity and external validity are judgment calls. So they're not necessarily something that you can just say, well, this has good external validity, this is good internal validity. You have to judge them based on the design of the study itself, the quality of the sample, and the claims that are being made. So like, again, the basic idea here is with internal validity, the nice thing is with an experiment, with a decent sample size and good random assignment, then that's going to have the best internal validity that you can have. Its sampling might be crap, though. Like if we're just using, say, like first year university students, maybe that doesn't generalize very well to a working population. So if we want to, like if we have first year university students and that's the population that we study, or that's the sample that we study, and we want to, and then we try to make claims about working adults, maybe that's not so great. Whereas, if we have a sample of maybe like third and fourth year university students who are all employed and working, 25 to 30 hours a week on average, then, and we want to make some claims about working adults from that, well, maybe we might be on we might have a better standing for that. So again, internal validity, the idea here is experiments maximize internal validity, but external validity is really about the sample. So we have to to address questions of external validity. What you're really wanting to do is ask questions about the sample. And moreover, not just about the sample, but then the claims that the researchers are making. So again, if I'm studying students and I'm making claims about working adults, maybe that's not the best external validity. Maybe I needed some at least more advanced students or students who had like full or nearly full-time employment to have some prayer of having external validity for a working sample. The only other thing that I'll say about external validity, though, is we often use that term interchangeably with what we call generalizability, which can be easier to understand. And again, the idea here is like a study with really good external validity has generalizability to at least some other contexts. Generalizability we sometimes talk about in terms of, to many of the contexts. But the basic idea here is like whatever claims we're going to make. If something is generalizable, it's generalizable in its claims. So, in IV causes DV, we observe that with good internal validity in an experiment with a robust sample, and therefore it's generalizable to these other contexts. So, like if you look at the taking care of the auditors study, we want to ask, is it an experimental design? So within this, people, like they brought people in, brought students into the study environment, and then they either watched a video portraying a pleasant environment or a video portraying an unpleasant environment, and then measured whether or not these student sample what their perception, like they asked them survey questions about their perception of the client's helpfulness, and then how much they trusted the client, and then the rigor to which they put that client to audit testing. So the basic idea here is, if it was a pleasant environment, they perceived the clients as more helpful, they trusted them more, and therefore tended to be less rigorous in their audit testing, whereas it was an unpleasant environment, they perceived them as less helpful, they were less trusting, and were more rigorous in the testing. Right? Now, again, so this is an experiment. Right? People are like the student population, the student sample was randomly assigned to whether they saw the pleasant or the unpleasant environment, and then everything else is the same between them, whether you were in the unpleasant or unpleasant condition, answered the same questions, basically you went through the same procedure. So that's one thing. So like this is the manipulation of the independent variable, and this is randomly assigned, blinded. So this helps take care of, like, that way there's no selection effect. People didn't volunteer for one condition or the other, or try or have any control over which condition they were in. They were just put into it. So that helps control, that helps protect against the selection effect. The fact that the overall procedure was the same regardless of which condition you were in helps to protect against the subject effect. So, people so it shouldn't be that people guessed that we want them to perceive the unpleasant environment as less helpful and have lower trust, right? It's just that that was their reaction to it. The natural reaction was that on average, people experiencing the unpleasant environment perceive them as less helpful and all of the stuff down below. So it's also worth, so participants were randomly assigned to one of the two levels of the independent variable. That's what I want to be a little clear on, because this can be a little tricky, especially since I've talked about experimental versus control condition. Here, there is no real control condition. What we'd want there is probably some kind of a neutral environment. So something wasn't either pleasant nor unpleasant. Here we have sort of like polarized options, so pleasant versus unpleasant. So what we can say about this is that pleasant is different than unpleasant, but it's hard to say by it's hard to anchor that without some sort of a neutral environment. So neither one of these is exactly what we talk about with a control condition. Like neither one of these is comparable to, say, the sugar pill example versus an experimental drug, just for what it's worth. And then again, to help balance this out so that there's less likelihood of any kind of subject effect happening here, all the other measures and procedures are constant, right? So it didn't matter whether you were in the pleasant or the unpleasant condition, everything else happened the same. So this is an experimental design. Could the selection effect have been a problem? Probably not, again, because the random assignment was what we sometimes call pristine, like it really held up. Could the subject effect have been a problem? Well, maybe it could always be a problem, but again, because the procedures are held constant across the two conditions, the experience of the two conditions should be pretty comparable to one another, so it seems unlikely that the subject effect would be a problem. Could the experimenter effect have been a problem? Well, there's nothing clearly demarcating that this is not a problem. Again, if double-blind procedures are used, such again, like if people sat down at a computer and then they were randomly, and so the computer sort of randomly assigned them to pleasant versus unpleasant outside of the control of the experimenter, then the experimenter has nothing to do with that decision, and therefore cannot be subtly communicating anything to the participant. So I think I think in general, depending how we set these up, there you go. So let's just talk briefly about the goal setting and performance study from last week. Was the independent variable manipulated? I am going to explain that, just since we're doing this asynchronously. Yeah, it was. Did the researchers, Morisano and colleagues, they did assign people to randomly to either, they did assign people to either you're in the goal setting condition or the control condition. Were the participants randomly assigned? Yeah. So there was no it wasn't like they were deciding based on, okay, you got into the sample based on whether or not you were on academic probation or academically at risk, I should say. Okay. But it wasn't people who are really academically at risk are going into the goal setting condition, and the ones who are only a little bit academically at risk are going into the control. No, nothing like that. It's just once they were in the sample, then they had an equal chance of being in the control versus the goal setting. Were extraneous variables controlled? Yes, again, because of the random assignment. With a reasonably large sample size, when people are randomly assigned, it shouldn't matter. Again, there might be random variation where, maybe there's more Black students in one condition than the other, more women in one condition than the other. But again, those are not going to be systematic. Again, random assignment is one of the main tools for controlling extraneous variables. And again, can we assess the internal validity? Well, there's no particular reason to think that there is going to be a problem with selection here, again, because of random assignment to the conditions. The subject effect, again, the participants were in the control condition, were doing a comparable difficulty task to the goal setting, just one that had nothing to do with goals or motivation. And the experimenter effect, again, is hard to diagnose because they do not, the study as reported, doesn't describe itself as double blind, and the only time that they are not double blind, perhaps there is some problems, and especially in a case like this where the experimenters are administering the stimuli. So they're giving, like the experimenter is giving the instructions on how to do the goal setting versus the distractor task. So it's a possibility. But again, all the other procedures are really tight, so I wouldn't put that at being an extremely risky, at extreme risk of the experimenter effect. So again, it's an experiment with random assignment and a manipulated variable, so I'd say it has probably pretty high internal validity in the fact that goal, and plus we can then draw on the vast literature that I mentioned last week that says, like, I mean, goal setting does tend to lead to better performance. Like setting difficult specific goals leads to better performance than most other kinds of goal type things. So probably true. Well, probably there's probably good evidence here. Actually, we're gonna skip that. We'll talk about this in the regular in the live session. The Facebook book experiment that the reading includes. So how Facebook affects well-being. We have two different studies here. The cross study was not is not an experiment because again in that case what people did was they were oh boy, what's going on with that one? Gonna get them mixed up. Let's say go with the other one. The Kramer study is described as an experimental design because there was control in this case. So we could see something. We could see the amount of time that people were, or the kind of information that people were exposed to online was controlled. Whereas in the cross study, all we saw was like the amount of time people spend online is inversely proportional to their sense of well-being, their happiness, for what it's worth. So if you spend a lot of time on Facebook, your satisfaction with life is lower. And again, that could be that, but the trouble with that is it could go either way. So with the non-experimental design in the cross study, maybe when you're in a bad mood, you go on Facebook just to like try to feel a little bit better, as opposed to you go on Facebook and it makes you feel worse. Whereas with the Kramer um, study, well, I'd like to hear in the live session what people think might be threats to internal validity. It might be better to talk about it than just have me say it. Now the question here, and this is what's going to lead us into our discussion of research ethics, is would you have objected if you learned that you had been a participant of the Facebook experiments in the Kramer study? Why or why not? So again, within this, they manipulated the content of people's news feed to include basically positive or negative elements without informed consent in this case. So would you have liked that or not? Sorry for that mess there. So just in general, with the research that we do in Man 420, this is usually considered minimal risk, right? So if people are not exposed to any risk they wouldn't be otherwise. Like, oh, like, hey, if you're handling paper, maybe you could get a paper cut. There might be eye strain from reading questions or something along those lines, but there's no more risk than they would expect to be exposed to in their ordinary daily life. So in general, the risk here is very, very low. So the kinds of things that not that we're conducting any active research this semester, but under most circumstances we do, and it's generally considered safe. And that's the kind of stuff that usually gets a rubber stamp from a university ethics committee. So, okay, yeah, no problem. There's no untoward risk to this. So go right ahead. Anyways, that's it for the lecture today. Thank you so much, and I'll see you soon.